Airports swallow people. They move too fast for those left behind. That's why no one noticed her at first. She was stretched across a hard plastic bench near Gate 27, her body still, her face turned toward the ceiling lights that buzzed faintly overhead. Her skin glistened with sweat, but her breathing was shallow, uneven, as if each inhale fought to stay alive. The people rushing past barely glanced her way. Some slowed for a heartbeat, their eyes narrowing in judgment before they looked away just as quickly. Others turned their heads, pretending they hadn't seen anything at all. She looked out of place among the rolling suitcases, glossy duty-free bags, and pressed business suits. Her shoes didn't match, one too large, the other torn at the sole. Her coat was wrinkled, sleeves fraying at the edges. Beside her, a handbag sagged, its zipper half broken, the contents tucked deep out of view. For hours, she had remained there, drifting in and out, life slipping quietly in public sight. At 6:17 p.m., a voice crackled over the radio of an airport officer. No ID, no ticket, no family or friends coming forward. She's been like this for hours. The reply came back flat, routine. Leave her there for now. If she wakes up, we'll ask questions. And so the crowd continued to rush past. A woman in heels stepped aside as if the unconscious figure were just another obstacle. A man tugging a restless child by the arm muttered about the mess. Even the officer who'd made the report eventually leaned against a column, bored, checking his watch instead of checking her pulse. No one stopped. Not until the sound of polished shoes cut across the terminal floor. Daniel Whitford had no reason to be there at that hour. The billionaire rarely walked through the main terminals of the empire he owned. When he visited his airports, he usually entered through executive lounges or restricted levels far above the passengers. But tonight, he had insisted on a ground-level inspection. Some said it was about efficiency. Others whispered it was about control. Whatever the reason, his unannounced walk meant that for once, the owner of the airport was seeing it the way ordinary travelers did, loud, hurried, and indifferent. He moved past the security gate with his assistant trailing 2 steps behind. His cufflinks caught the fluorescent glare as he adjusted them, his jaw set with its usual expression of impatience. To him, terminals were just arteries of commerce, and people, for the most part, were traffic. Until his eyes landed on the bench. A figure. Unmoving. He slowed. The assistant began rattling off numbers about flight delays and concessions revenue, but Daniel's attention had already shifted. Something in him froze, not at the sight of chaos or inconvenience, but at the stillness in the middle of it all. He turned slightly, watching the officer who had been leaning on the column, the passengers who walked around without pause, the way everyone seemed intent on pretending she wasn't there. And then he looked back at her. For a moment, the noise of the terminal seemed to dim. She wasn't a statistic or a line item on a report. She was a human being who looked like she'd been abandoned in a place where no one was supposed to be left behind. Her chest rose faintly, then fell, so weak it seemed it might not rise again. Daniel's stride slowed completely. He stopped in front of the bench. Something inside him shifted. Before I continue, if you're watching this, hit the subscribe button so you never miss powerful stories like this one. And let me know in the comments which country you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. He reached out, placing one hand on the back of the bench as he leaned slightly forward. The woman's head tilted toward him, her lips trembling with a whisper he couldn't quite hear. Daniel Whitford, the man who owned the airport, the man known for never stopping for anything, stood frozen. Because in that instant, something inside him refused to let him walk away. And that's where everything changed. Daniel moved closer, his polished shoes slowing against the terminal floor. For a moment, he only stared down at her, the weight of silence pressing against the noise of the crowd. The woman's chest lifted faintly, but her face was flushed with fever, her breath shallow and ragged. He reached forward and set his hand gently on her forearm. Heat surged into his palm. Not the warmth of life. This was scorching. Unnatural, a fire burning through her skin. His composure cracked. "She's burning up," he said flatly, though no one had asked him to speak. The officer beside the column straightened, startled. "Sir, we get medical down here." Now, Daniel's voice cut through, sharper than the overhead announcements. "Shut down this gate until further notice. Redirect traffic." The command rippled instantly. His assistant fumbled for a phone, relaying orders. Officers scrambled to reroute passengers. Within seconds, Gate 27 began to empty, leaving only the woman on the bench, the billionaire standing over her, and a handful of stunned onlookers whispering. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. Her lips parted, dry and cracked. Words escaped faint as paper tearing. "Please, don't let them take me." His hand froze mid-motion. The officer leaned closer, confused. What did she just say? She clutched at her worn handbag, fingers trembling, knuckles white. Whatever she carried in that sagging leather bag, she held onto it as though it were her last anchor to life. Her eyes fluttered open just enough for Daniel to see the desperation behind them. Not fear of dying, but fear of being taken. For once, he had no immediate answer. Billionaires are trained by life fix broken deals, not broken people. Daniel had spent years shaping airports, terminals, runways, mergers, fortunes, empires measured in billions. If there was a delay, he bought new systems. If there was resistance, he bought the company outright. He'd never bent low to catch the faint breath of a woman forgotten on a bench. And yet, here he was. Passengers had stopped beyond the security line, drawn by the commotion. Phones hovered, recording. Whispers floated through the thinning crowd. Some muttered about lawsuits, others about scandal. None of them mattered to Daniel in that moment. The medics finally rushed in, uniforms bright against the dull gray of the concourse. They carried a stretcher and medical packs, ready to lift her. But the woman jerked faintly, clutching her bag tighter, her voice cracking again. "No, don't take me. Don't let them." The medic hesitated. "Sir, we need to move her." Daniel didn't move aside. He studied her face, the way she trembled, the way her eyes darted to every stranger like they might rip her away. "You heard her," he said quietly, but with an authority that stopped the team cold. "No one touches her until she knows she's safe." The room held its breath. Even the officer from before lowered his gaze. Daniel crouched now, lowering himself to her level. The billionaire who stood above thousands every day placed himself in front of one forgotten woman. He reached for her hand. Not the bag, not her shoulder, but her hand. Her grip was weak, shaking, but she didn't let go. "I'm not letting anyone take you," he said, his voice steady. "You're safe here." Her eyes closed, a single tear slipping down her temple. Her body sagged as if she'd released the last of her strength into his palm. Daniel rose again, his face unreadable but his jaw tight. He looked at the medic. "Now, take her to the infirmary. Use the private wing." "Sir, that's reserved for her," he snapped. The stretcher moved forward. As they lifted her gently, her bag slipped slightly open. For a brief moment, Daniel caught sight of what was inside. A folded photograph, edges worn from handling, and a small child's toy peeking out from beneath it. His chest tightened. He turned away quickly, adjusting his cufflink out of habit, but the action felt hollow. Because for the first time in years, Daniel Whitford, the man who owned the airport, who thought he'd seen everything, realized he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't simply buy his way out of. And when he glanced back, he caught her lips moving once more. "Don't leave me." This time the words were clear. He didn't walk away. But he had no idea what staying would cost him. The stretcher wheels echoed against the polished floors as the medical team pushed her through a set of restricted doors, far from the gaze of curious travelers. The VIP infirmary at Whitford International wasn't designed for strangers who collapsed on benches. It was meant for diplomats, executives, and heads of state who demanded discretion. But now, for the first time, a woman with no ticket, no identification, and no record was brought into its guarded halls. The nurses worked quickly, sliding IV lines into her arm, wrapping a blood pressure cuff around her wrist. One of them pressed cool cloths against her forehead while another adjusted the oxygen flow. The monitor above her bed beeped softly, its rhythm uneven. "Severe dehydration," a nurse murmured while jotting down notes. "Exhaustion. Temperature's at 104. If we don't bring it down, it could trigger seizures." Daniel stood just inside the doorway, his hands folded tightly behind his back. He had watched crises unfold before. Airline strikes, legal disputes, accidents on runways. He had always been composed, detached, his face carved into the mask of a man who never allowed the unexpected to rattle him. But tonight, something pressed against that mask, cracking it from the inside. His assistant lingered behind him, tapping furiously on a tablet to record orders and reroute security. Still, Daniel's eyes never left the bed. The woman stirred, her lips trembling, Her voice barely carried, yet the words cut straight through the sterile air. I thought this place would be safe. Daniel's throat tightened. The medical team leaned in, thinking she was hallucinating, but Daniel's mind had already shifted far from the room. A memory surfaced, unwanted, uninvited. He was 12 again, standing in a crowded grocery store in Atlanta. His mother had collapsed suddenly, her knees buckling on the worn linoleum floor. He remembered how her hand had reached out, trembling, searching for help, and how the crowd had parted around her, people stepping back, eyes wide with discomfort, pretending they hadn't seen anything. No one helped. Not until a neighbor arrived, minutes later, and carried her to a chair. The shame of that memory had buried itself deep in Daniel's chest. That day he swore he'd build a life where no one could leave him powerless again. And he had done just that. Billionaire, owner of airports, airlines, and sprawling enterprises, he had designed a world where everything obeyed his command. And yet, as he looked at the woman on the bed now, sweat rolling down her temples, her words clawed at him like the echo of that night. I thought this place would be safe. One of the nurses glanced back at him nervously. Sir, she'll stabilize, but she needs rest. We'll run full panels, blood work, vitals, everything. Do you want us to report directly to the state intake system? Daniel's reply was immediate. No. Keep this internal. Nothing leaves this room. Understood? The nurse hesitated, then nodded. They had worked long enough under his empire to know that when Daniel Whitford gave an order, it was not a suggestion. He stepped closer to the bed. Her face was thinner than he'd first realized. Her hair clung damply to her skin, and though she looked fragile, there was something in the way she clutched at the blanket even in her sleep, a strength fighting not to disappear. Daniel studied her features and found himself unsettled. Why did she seem familiar? Who is she? His assistant whispered behind him. Daniel didn't answer. His jaw tightened as the thought formed in his mind. She didn't come here by accident. The monitor beeped again, steadier now. Her chest rose and fell in rhythm with the IV's slow drip. She turned her head slightly toward Daniel, her lips moving once more. Don't leave me. He leaned down, straining to catch the words. For a man who had spent decades walking away from anything that wasn't business, the request struck him harder than any boardroom defeat. He straightened slowly, eyes fixed on her, and for the first time that night, Daniel knew he wouldn't be able to detach. This wasn't just another crisis at Whitford International. This was personal, and it was only the beginning. Hours passed before the medical wing finally steadied. The woman's fever was lowering, though she remained unconscious, her chest rising with fragile rhythm beneath the thin blanket. The nurses moved quietly around her bed, their voices hushed as if the silence itself carried weight. But Daniel was not watching her anymore. His gaze had shifted to the folder in his hand. The file was thinner than he expected. Far too thin. For someone who had collapsed in the middle of an international terminal, there should have been records, some trace of a ticket, an ID scan, a boarding pass. Yet the folder held almost nothing. No passport? Daniel asked, his voice clipped. None, sir, his assistant replied, standing rigid near the wall. No state ID, no driver's license, no match to any domestic database. Daniel flipped the page. Blank. No entries. No past. How did she even get inside the terminal? Security hesitated before answering. We traced her as far as the East Concourse, but then there's a gap. Camera feeds dropped for nearly 15 minutes near Gate 8. It's logged as a system reboot. But, his voice trailed off under Daniel's stare. But, Daniel's tone sharpened. It's irregular, sir. System reboots are scheduled, never random. This one happened at the exact time she appeared. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. Irregularities weren't tolerated in his empire. Every terminal, every gate, every second of transit was meant to operate with efficiency bordering on perfection. Yet this woman had stepped through a crack in his system, one he hadn't authorized. He shut the folder with a snap. No ID, no record, no ticket, and she walks into my airport through a blackout? His assistant swallowed hard. It could be coincidence. Daniel's jaw tightened. Coincidence had no place in billion-dollar infrastructure. Every minute was accounted for, every action traceable. That was the foundation of his empire, which made her presence not just suspicious, but deliberate. A nurse entered quietly, holding a chart. Sir, we completed her blood panel. Daniel waved her forward. The nurse hesitated, only a second before setting the paper on the desk. Her type is AB negative. It's extremely rare, less than 1% of the population. Daniel stared at the letters circled in blue ink. The air in the room seemed to thin. AB negative, his own blood type. The nurse continued cautiously. She's stable now, but we need to identify next of kin. Without documentation, she'll be flagged for state intervention unless... She let the unfinished sentence hang, unless someone powerful intervened. Daniel lowered the chart slowly. His mind replayed the words. Less than 1%. He remembered the long recovery after his surgery 3 years ago, the donation he'd made after, his name logged in a national registry that only flagged rare matches. The thought crept in before he could push it away. Why here? Why now? And why her? He stood abruptly, moving toward the window that overlooked the airfield. Beyond the glass, planes gleamed under bright floodlights, lined up like obedient soldiers awaiting his command. But for once, Daniel felt something slipping from his control. "Sir?" his assistant asked carefully. Daniel didn't turn. His voice was quieter, but sharper than before. "This doesn't happen in my airports. Not by chance. I want everything. Every report, every scrap of data on who she is and how she got here." He looked back at the folder resting on the desk. Thin, almost empty. A billionaire could predict mergers, stock swings, even global markets. But what stood in that room defied prediction. A woman who should not have been there, carrying his blood type, arriving through a gap that shouldn't exist. Coincidence? Or fate? Daniel's fingers tapped once against the glass. "Find out," he said quietly, "because I need to know why she came here, to my airport." His reflection stared back at him, hard and unsettled. And for the first time in years, he wondered if the empire he built had led him straight to something he wasn't prepared to face. The room had settled into a hush, broken only by the steady beep of the monitor. Daniel stood with the file still clutched in his hand, his reflection lingering in the glass wall. He had been staring at the runway lights when the knock came. It was soft, hesitant, like someone unsure they had the right to interrupt. "Come in," Daniel said, without turning. The door opened, and a woman in a dark maintenance uniform stepped inside. Her hair was streaked with silver, pulled neatly back beneath her cap. She carried herself with the quiet humility of someone who had worked invisible jobs for decades. A badge on her chest read Rosa Alvarez, Custodial Services. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Whitford, I thought you should know something." Daniel finally turned. His assistant looked up, frowning at the intrusion, but Daniel lifted a hand to silence him. "Go on." Rosa's voice trembled at first, then steadied. "I've seen her before, not tonight, days ago, near Gate 8. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "You're certain?" She nodded quickly. "She wasn't causing trouble. She'd just sit there on her bag for hours, always looking toward the arrivals' doors like she was waiting for someone. Not lost, waiting." Daniel's chest tightened. "Gate 8, the very corridor where the cameras had gone dark." Rosa went on, "And she wasn't alone. She had a child with her, a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Curly hair, holding a toy rabbit, sweet-looking but quiet, clung to her mother's side." The silence in the room grew heavier. Daniel's assistant shifted uneasily. "There's no child listed in her intake, no one brought in with her." Rosa shook her head. "That's why I came. Tonight she was alone, no child in sight. I don't know where the little girl went." Daniel's jaw flexed. He glanced toward the bed, where the woman lay unconscious, her breathing shallow. The image of a child's toy he'd glimpsed in her bag replayed in his mind. Rosa clasped her hands in front of her. "I asked once if she needed help. Told her I could call security or someone from information. She just smiled and said she was waiting for someone kind." Daniel froze. The phrase struck him like a physical blow. Someone kind. It had been years, but he could still hear his late wife's voice speaking those same words. She had said them often, when coaxing him to donate to hospitals, when reminding him to slow down and treat people as more than numbers. "The world doesn't need more rich men," she had told him. "It needs someone kind." He had buried that memory deep, smothered it beneath boardrooms and contracts. But now, spoken by a woman lying lifeless in his private infirmary, the words came back sharp and undeniable. Rosa's voice softened. She trusted someone would find her. She told her little girl the same, said they just had to wait long enough. Daniel looked down, his grip tightening around the folder until the edges bent. His mind raced. A woman with no record, a child who had vanished, a a gap in his own security system, and a phrase tied to the one person he had loved and lost. It was too much to be chance. "Thank you, Rosa," he said finally. His tone was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight pressing on him. "You've done well. That will be all." She hesitated, then nodded and quietly slipped out, the door closing behind her. Daniel remained still for a long moment, the air heavy around him. He turned back toward the bed. The woman shifted faintly, lips moving in a murmur too soft to hear. But Daniel didn't need the exact words. His instincts told him she carried more than fever in her silence. He stepped closer, his reflection merging with hers in the glass panel beside the bed. And for the first time in years, Daniel Whitford, a man who trusted only control, felt the cold grip of uncertainty. Because if Rosa was right, there was a missing child somewhere inside his airport, and she might be his only link to finding her. The infirmary had settled into a fragile calm. Machines hummed quietly, the monitors steadying after hours of fever spikes. The woman's body no longer shivered under the blankets. A faint color returned to her cheeks. Daniel remained rooted in the corner, arms folded, staring at her with a focus that unsettled even his assistant. Normally he would have left long ago, passing responsibility down the chain. But this time, he couldn't. Something anchored him to her bed, though he couldn't explain what. The nurse adjusted the IV, then glanced at Daniel. "She's stabilizing, might start talking as the fever breaks." Daniel gave no reply, but his gaze sharpened. He needed answers. Minutes stretched before her eyelids fluttered open, lashes trembling. Her lips parted, dry and cracked. The sound that came out was little more than breath, yet it was enough to freeze him. "Amara Lewis." Daniel's body stiffened as if struck. The name cut through him, sharp and undeniable. The nurse leaned closer. What did she say? But Daniel already knew. Amara. The syllables dragged him back to a time he had buried under contracts and capital. He was 25 again, walking across a university courtyard with her at his side. She had been different from anyone he had ever known. Brilliant, uncompromising, a law student who challenged him with every word. While others had been impressed by his ambition, Amara had stared him down with fire in her eyes. "You think money is enough," she had told him once, standing in the shadow of a library archway. "But you'll never understand the value of people over profit. And one day, that will cost you more than money ever could." He remembered the way she walked away, her heels striking the pavement like punctuation. She had never looked back. He hadn't chased her. He had been too certain of his future, too consumed by the empire he was building. In his world, love was a distraction, not an investment. And now, years later, here she was, or someone bearing her name, collapsed in his airport, fighting for her life. The nurse adjusted her again, oblivious to the storm breaking across Daniel's features. His assistant finally stepped forward. "Sir, is that name familiar?" Daniel's eyes remained locked on her. His voice, when it came, was quiet but iron-willed. "Yes, too familiar." He studied her face more intently now. The fever had blurred her features earlier, but with her skin cooling and her breaths evening, the outlines sharpened. The cheekbones, the curve of her jaw, the strength hidden even in her stillness. It was her, Amara Lewis. The woman who had once told him his empire would never fill the emptiness of a life without kindness. His stomach tightened. If this was truly her, then why here? Why now? And what had she been doing in his airport with a child at her side? Her lips trembled again, whispering fragments too faint to catch. Daniel leaned closer, straining to hear. The only word that came clear was, safe. The same word Rosa had repeated. The same word that echoed from his late wife's memory. Safe. Daniel drew back slowly, his mind a whirlwind. Coincidence? Or fate dragging the past into his empire with no warning? His assistant shifted uneasily. "Sir, do you want me to?" "No," Daniel cut him off, sharper than intended. "No one outside this room hears that name, not yet." He stood tall again, adjusting his cufflink in a motion that once grounded him, but now felt empty. His gaze returned to Amara, her face slack with exhaustion, but marked with a history he could no longer ignore. If this truly was the same woman, then her collapse was not an accident, and her return carried questions that could dismantle the empire he had built. Because Amara Lewis had always been the one person Daniel Whitford could never walk away from. The infirmary was quieter now. Machines beeped steadily, nurses moved in and out with soft efficiency, and the air felt thick with expectation. Daniel remained close to the bed, his eyes fixed on the woman whose presence had cracked open pieces of his past. He hadn't moved in nearly an hour, but his mind had been racing non-stop. A knock came at the door. Not sharp, but cautious. Daniel turned. Rosa stepped inside, her cap in hand, her eyes hesitant. She carried something folded in her palm. I went back to gate 8, she began, her voice low. While cleaning earlier, I noticed she left her bag half open. I didn't touch much, but this, she held up a crumpled photograph. This slipped out. Daniel gestured for her to come forward. She placed the photograph into his hand with surprising care, as though it carried more weight than paper should. He unfolded it slowly. The edges were frayed, the surface creased from years of handling. The image was blurred but unmistakable. Amara, younger, standing in front of a modest apartment building. Beside her, a little girl no more than 5, holding tightly to her mother's hand. Daniel's pulse quickened. The girl's curls framed her small face, and her wide eyes seemed to peer straight through the years, straight through him. He swallowed hard. The eyes, the unmistakable shape of them. The same eyes that stared back at him in the mirror every morning. On the back of the photograph, scrawled in uneven handwriting, were 4 words that tightened his chest. Headed west, find someone kind. The phrase hit him like a hammer. Again, those same words, the same message that had shadowed him since Rosa first repeated it. He gripped the photograph tighter, his knuckles whitening. This wasn't chance. It wasn't random. Amara hadn't stumbled into his airport at all. She had come here deliberately. Behind him, his assistant shifted nervously. Sir, that could just be coincidence. Daniel cut him a sharp look, silencing him. Coincidence had already been burned out of his vocabulary tonight. Rosa spoke again, her voice trembling. Mr. Whitford, that little girl, she was with her before. I saw them together. Daniel glanced at Amara. Her body twitched faintly, her lips moving again as though words clung to her even in fevered sleep. He leaned closer. This time, the whisper came clearer. Don't let them take her. The room seemed to constrict around him. Don't let them take her. Not me. Hey. Daniel straightened, his jaw tightening. If Amara had collapsed here alone, then where was the child? What had happened to her in the chaos of that 15-minute blackout in his terminal? He looked back at the photograph, at the little girl's eyes, eyes that mirrored his own. The thought rose unbidden, dangerous, undeniable. Could she be mine? The possibility pressed against him like a weight he wasn't prepared to carry. For a man who measured his empire in billions, who had built towers that scraped the clouds, this single photograph carried more power than any contract he had ever signed. He slipped the picture into his breast pocket. This doesn't leave this room, he said quietly, his voice like steel. No one outside needs to know what we've found. Rosa nodded quickly. His assistant hesitated, then followed suit. Daniel turned back to the bed. Amara shifted again, her hand clenching weakly against the blanket as though fighting against invisible hands. Don't let them take her, she murmured once more, the plea carving itself into the air. Daniel leaned closer, his voice low but resolute. No one is taking her. But even as he said the words, the question burned hotter inside him. Where is the child now? The monitor beeped steadily, the machines hummed, and outside the window, the tarmac lights blinked like watchful eyes. Daniel Whitford, man of control, master of empires, stood powerless against a truth he couldn't ignore. Because the photograph didn't just show a child. It showed a future that might already belong to him. The photograph burned in Daniel's pocket as he strode down the corridor. His steps echoed against the sterile floor, each one sharper than the last. The image of the little girl's eyes refused to leave his mind. The more he tried to dismiss it, the more those eyes stared back at him with a familiarity he could not shake. When he reached the security command hub, the room snapped to attention. Screens flickered with live feeds from every corner of Whitford International. Rows of operators leaned forward, anxious under the weight of his presence. Daniel didn't waste time. Find her, he ordered. Every terminal, every corridor, I want every second of the last 48 hours scrubbed. A child, female, age 5 or 6, curly hair, carrying a toy rabbit. She was with the woman in my infirmary. She is somewhere in this airport, or someone took her. Silence spread for a moment. Then operators rushed to replay footage, cameras fast-forwarding and rewinding in frantic loops. Dozens of angles streamed across the wall of screens. Passengers in suits, families dragging luggage, children clutching snacks. Yet none of them matched the description. Nothing at gate 7, one voice called. Clean at gate 10, another replied. Minutes dragged on, but the girl never appeared. Not boarding, not exiting, not even wandering the concourse. Daniel's chest tightened. Don't tell me she disappeared into thin air. Keep looking. Behind him, Carter, his longtime assistant, cleared his throat. Sir, there's something else. Daniel turned sharply. What? Carter tapped his tablet nervously, then projected a feed onto the central screen. The footage glitched, the frame stuttering before cutting to black. A red timestamp blinked in the corner. This gap right here. Gate 8. The system logged a reboot at the exact time the woman first entered the concourse. Daniel's jaw locked. Reboots are scheduled, not random. Yes, sir. Which means this wasn't a malfunction. Someone forced it, and whatever happened during those 15 minutes, we can't see it. The room went still. Daniel stepped closer to the screen, staring at the black void. 15 minutes erased from the most secure airport in the country. 15 minutes where a woman with no ID and a child at her side slipped inside. The thought hit him like a strike of lightning. Was the girl taken during that blackout, or did she vanish on her own? For a man who built his empire on eliminating unknowns, this was intolerable. He turned to the head of security. Shut down speculation. No leaks to the press, no whispers outside this room. Triple patrols on every exit. I don't care if you search every closet and crawl space. We don't stop until we find her. The man nodded, already issuing commands. Daniel's voice deepened, carrying the weight of something beyond business. This isn't a corporate directive. This is personal. That child is somewhere in my airport, and if anyone so much as touched her, I will know. Operators glanced at each other, stunned. They were used to Daniel Whitford's authority in matters of finance, logistics, contracts. But this was something raw, unfiltered. Carter spoke again, softer this time. Sir, do you think the girl is hers? Amara's? Daniel's eyes narrowed. We'll confirm later. Right now, she's a child in danger. That's all that matters. He pressed his hand against the photograph in his pocket, feeling the creases of the paper beneath his palm. The words written on the back returned to him. Find someone kind. His late wife's voice echoed in his memory, layered over Amara's faint plea. Don't let them take her. For once, Daniel wasn't thinking about balance sheets, investors, or board meetings. The empire he had built could wait. This wasn't about billions. It was about a child who might carry his eyes, and the promise of a woman who had once walked away. Daniel straightened, his voice carrying through the command hub like a vow. We don't stop until we find her. The laboratory wing hummed with urgency. Daniel stood at the edge of the room, his posture iron, though inside he felt the press of questions that no empire could silence. A technician laid a sealed folder on the table. Rushed panel, she said quickly, her voice respectful under his gaze. We compared her blood results against national registries and flagged anomalies. There's something unusual. Daniel opened the file. His eyes scanned the lines. AB negative. The rarest of rare. A type shared by less than 1% of the population. And now, highlighted across the page, a match, distant but undeniable, to a record he recognized. His own. The room tilted for a moment, though he didn't show it. He had given blood once, after surgery years ago, and his donation had been cataloged. Now the system had cross-referenced it. The woman on the bed wasn't just another patient who'd collapsed in his terminal. She was tied to him in ways he hadn't expected, hadn't prepared for. Carter cleared his throat cautiously. So, not coincidence then. Daniel closed the file with a controlled motion, but his knuckles whitened. No, not coincidence. He turned back toward the infirmary bed. Nurses had pulled the blanket higher across her shoulders, cooling cloths resting against her forehead. The fever had begun to break, her breathing steadier, her body no longer racked by tremors. Daniel stepped closer. Her eyelids flickered, lashes twitching against her skin. Then slowly they opened. The dark irises found him through the haze of exhaustion, faint recognition stirring. Her lips parted, and the word came like a ghost dragged out of memory. Daniel? The sound of his name from her mouth froze him in place. Yes, he said, his voice low, unfamiliar even to himself. Her throat worked as though speaking was pain. Tears welled, slipping down her temples into the pillow. She reached weakly toward him, her fingers trembling, fragile as paper. He hesitated, then closed the distance, his hand enveloping hers. "I couldn't let her grow up invisible," she whispered, the words broken but fierce. "She's yours too." The room seemed to collapse into silence. Nurses exchanged stunned looks. Carter lowered his eyes, and for once, Daniel felt the air itself heavy with truth. "She's yours too." The words rang louder than the roar of jet engines outside the glass walls. Louder than the boardroom applause he had lived on for decades. Louder than the silence he had wrapped around himself all these years. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, to protest the years of distance and the cruelty of not knowing. But nothing came out. The weight of her confession pressed too deeply. He looked at her, at the woman who had once walked away because she said he'd never understand people over profit. And here she was, returning not with accusation, but with a truth that shattered his certainty. His empire suddenly felt small, his billions meaningless. Because there on the bed was Amara Lewis, his past, and somewhere in the vast corridors of his airport was a child who might carry his blood. He sat slowly, his hand still holding hers. Her grip was faint but steady. Her lips trembled again. "Find her, Daniel, please. Don't let them." She coughed, the sound raw, painful. "Don't let them take her." His jaw hardened, but his chest ached. For the first time, Daniel Whitford, the man who prided himself on controlling every outcome, was staring at a truth he hadn't seen coming. He might have a daughter, and she was missing. He leaned forward, voice low, steady, the way he gave orders before entire empires moved at his command. "I'll find her." Amara's eyes closed again, tears still clinging to her lashes. Relief softened her features, as though the promise was enough to hold her through the storm. Daniel sat back, his mind reeling. This was no longer about a lost child in his airport. This was blood. This was legacy. And this was the one battle he could not afford to lose. The night deepened over Whitford International. Planes slept quietly on the runways, their lights winking against the darkness, but inside the private infirmary the world had shifted. Daniel sat at Amara's bedside, the photograph pressed into his chest pocket, the weight of its truth pressing heavier than any ledger he had ever balanced. Wealth builds empires. It buys silence. It bends time. It bends people. Daniel had built his name on those rules. But sitting in that sterile room, his hand wrapped around Amara's frail fingers, he realized something no boardroom had ever taught him. It only takes one forgotten life to shatter the illusion of control. Her breathing was steadier now, though each inhale sounded like a battle won. The fever had eased, but the exhaustion in her body clung to her like chains. Still, when her hand twitched against his, he gripped tighter, unwilling to let her fall back into the void she had been drifting in for hours. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "And so is she. I'll find her." Her eyelids fluttered, and for a fleeting moment, her eyes opened. They found him, dim with fatigue but bright with a flicker of hope. A tear slipped down her cheek as if she'd been carrying those words in silence for years, waiting to believe them. Daniel leaned forward, his voice lower still. "No one will take her. No one will take you. Not while I have breath in my body." Her lips curved faintly as if she were too weak for a smile but too stubborn not to try. Then her eyes closed again, but her hand clung to his. Daniel stayed there, watching her, and for the first time in years, the billionaire who measured his days in contracts and capital felt the cracks of emptiness inside himself closing. They thought she was just another face on a bench, another inconvenience in a world too busy to notice. But they were wrong. She carried the future of an empire in her veins, not because of fortune, but because of blood, because of love, because of truth. And as he sat there, Daniel understood something he had resisted all his life. He had spent decades rescuing companies, rescuing deals, rescuing profits from the brink of collapse, but he had never rescued himself. Until now, because in saving Amara, he wasn't just protecting her. She was saving him from the hollow empire he had built, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. She was giving him something he had never bought and never earned, a reason to be more than rich, a reason to be human. The silence in the room thickened, but it no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like the beginning of something he hadn't dared to believe in for years. Beyond the glass, the runways gleamed and rose, stretching toward the horizon. For once, Daniel didn't see them as assets, as profit streams, as numbers climbing across quarterly reports. He saw them as pathways. 1,000 different directions where life could change, where choices could lead to something real. And his choice tonight was clear. He would not let the child vanish into shadows. He would not let Amara's voice go unheard. He would stand, not as Daniel Whitford the billionaire, not as a titan of steel and terminals, but as a man who had been given one more chance to do something right. The empire could wait. Humanity could not. And now I'll ask you the same question Daniel faced. What would you have done in Daniel's place? Drop your answer in the comments, and don't forget to tell me which country you're watching from. And if stories like this move you the way they moved me, hit that like and subscribe button to join us here on Souls and Riches Stories channel, because lessons are priceless.